All right, guys, this is the last set of notes for this unit. So now we're going to kind of bring some genetics into it as far as genes and variations within the population. Okay, so first definition. What is a gene pool? Well, it's all the alleles. Guys, think back to December when we did genetics. Alleles were the letters, like an uppercase T versus a lowercase t. So this is basically all the gene choices in a population. And they can change if certain alleles have a survival advantage over a different allele. And so like how many alleles are in the population can start to favor one over the other depending on environmental changes. Okay, so we're going to talk about three types of natural selection that we see in the environment. The first one is stabilizing selection. This is where it favors the average individuals in a population. And when this happens over many years, it starts to reduce variation because the same one's being favored in a population. So, like the extremes, the highs and the lows start to kind of fade out, and we're just favoring that average. So, it really reduces variation. An example is Siberian husky weight. So, huskies are used for work. The larger muscled huskies actually kind of sink in through the snow because they're too heavy, so they cannot be used for work. And the smaller muscles are not strong enough to carry the cargo. So over time, nature has selected for the average weight size, and so most huskies are around that weight. Human birth weight is also an example. Large babies are usually too difficult to make it through the birth canal, and small babies have a lower chance of survival. So there is about the average, I'd say probably 6 to 8 um, pounds is about average. Anything above that or lower than that, there's not as many. Doesn't mean there isn't any, but nature favors that average weight. That's the highest chance of survival. On a graph, and you'll see this in your homework that we will have for today. This is stabilizing. So we're looking at the dotted line. The background is kind of, or well, this is the original population, the dotted line. Okay. And then notice that this is after population favors the average. So we're not seeing any extremes. It's just favoring the average. Now be careful. I'm not 100% sure. I'll have to double check on the homework. The homework might switch these. Just pay attention to before and after. So it might show like maybe the solid line looks like this, and then they draw the dotted line as the after. So really pay attention to what your homework is labeling. But stabilizing is selection against both extremes, and see here we're favoring the middle. Okay, the next one is directional selection. It favors one of the extreme variations of a trait. When this happens, we see rapid evolution. And I always like to joke, I don't know if you guys know the band One Direction, but that's how you remember this one. It favors one, it's directional. So One Direction. I know it's cheesy, but that's a way to remember it. Okay, greyhounds. And a lot of times, guys, humans can kind of sway natural selection in some species, which we'll see here. Europeans breed these dogs for their speed. So, you have average speed, those that are slower and fast, but humans started crossbreeding and selecting those for the fastest speed so that they could win in the race. And so now most of them have a pretty fast speed. Here's another one. This is crazy. I always show this every year because I just think it's crazy. So actually, way, way back in the day, horses used to be really small. I'm talking really tiny. And they actually, instead of hooves, they had kind of like fingers. And they used to climb trees. So that's kind of crazy. Real small, climb trees, and look at fingers. Over time, grasslands expanded um, in the area that they were in. So they had further to walk for food and things like that. So over time, nature, they didn't really need, the extra grass for climbing trees. So over time, nature selected fewer and fewer. You can kind of see how they're going back in time. And actually, because they had longer distances, their legs expanded over time. Nature selected for longer legs until we get the modern day horse. So it's kind of crazy to see. These environmental changes produce selective pressures that favored fewer toes and higher, longer wearing teeth than horses as well. So horses have gone through a lot of changes over the year. Okay, here's a directional graph. So here's our original population. It could go either left or right, but in this case, they show going to the right. It's favoring one extreme. So let's say the extreme here was more toes. These were fewer toes. Or I'm sorry, these were fewer toes and this was more toes because it favored fewer. So it just kind of depends how you're labeling it, but you see a shift in the graph. Okay, the last one is disruptive selection. Favors either extreme. So we're kind of going against the middle group. Sometimes over time, we eventually get no middle group and we actually develop into two new species. That's called speciation because they're no longer, they can't breed with each other anymore once they become different species. So an example is palms. They're the same species, excuse me. But there's some that were better surviving in the calcareous soil and some in the volcanic soil. And then over time, they only mated at certain times of the year, and eventually they no longer can mate based on, and they become two different species based on the different soil that they preferred. So the palms in the volcanic soil flowered later than palms in calcareous soil, and eventually it caused speciation, and they're two different types of species. Here's another one, the African swallowtail. So we see yellow, we see a darker color and a lighter color, and the female is able to, these two are able to imitate other butterflies that are poisonous, and this one is not. So it gets eaten by predators. So you can see this is the original population, but it's nature's selecting the two extremes. So you see a huge dip in the middle, and over time, this one could eventually become extinct. Okay, so let's talk about speciation. This is the evolution of a new species over time. Factors that affect speciation, small population size, isolation, populations can become separated, which causes them to no longer, and guys, remember, species is anything that can breed. So if the species can no longer breed and provide for viable offspring, then it is not considered the same species. Okay, so let's talk about causes of speciation. All this, guys, will be on your homework activity for today. First one, geographic. Organisms cannot come into contact and therefore can't interbreed, just based on geography. Let's talk about Darwin's finches. Finches become isolated on different islands. So you know the Galapagos Islands, that's where Darwin studied. Um, Over time, different traits are selected for or against, so their diet was very different. So this one might have had large nuts or seeds that were hard, and it had a bigger beak, and maybe these are eating more insects because it has a sharper bill. You know, it just kind of depends what's on their island. And depending what's on their island, change their beak shape. So over time, these actually became different, even though they're all finches that were once the same species, they're all different. They cannot interbreed anymore because over time they have adapted to their specific island. Here's another one. This is the Isthmus of Panama. You can see this canal here. They all were on one side, but over time they ended up on different sides. The Cortez rainbow wrasse, and they all came from the same ancestor, but when that formed here, it split the two, and now they have very different colorations and patterns, and they cannot interbreed as well. Okay, the next one is temporal, and this is when basically species reproduce at different times. So obviously, if reproduction is not happening at the same time, then they're not able to reproduce with each other. Oh, our good cicadas. These things are nasty. They come out so they had a common ancestor cicada, but there is a 13-year one and a 17-year one, and they come out at different times, obviously. There are annual ones in Missouri, so some that come out every year, but then like the really gross ones, I don't know if you guys remember 2015, those things are nasty. Uh, they come out in 17-year periods or 13 years, depending on when they come out of the ground. Okay, and the last one, this one's kind of interesting. This is behavioral. Two populations could interbreed, so they actually can, but they have different courtship rituals or other strategies involving behavior. So they are actually the same species, but then over time, they do not have the same behavior. So let me give you an example here. We have the fruit fly. They used to lay eggs on hawthorn fruit, Now, only one population lays eggs on apples. So the fruit ripens at different times. So adult emerge and mate at different times. So based on where they reproduce, causes them to be different species because of behavior. Here was an interesting one that they did. They just did this in a lab. So they took one species of fruit flies and they gave one group, they'll say group A, starch, the other group maltose, and notice those are types of sugars. Well, starch is a polymer, but over time, they did about 8 generations, and then they try to put them together, and they wouldn't based on what they ate. So sometimes behavior can cause speciations as well.